Joey from the Digital Humanities Innovation Lab at Simon Fraser University Library. And I'm presenting with my colleagues, Rebecca Dowson and Ali Moore. And we're very excited today to talk about some of the challenges and questions and approaches that we've been bumping up against in dealing with, as their title says, upgrading everything everywhere all at once. And in a nice bit of serendipity this morning, I was working on the presentation, trying to make sure I had everything, and then my computer was saying, you need to do updates, and it's a university-owned computer, so I had to do them. And I think it kind of underscored for me, at least, that these upgrades are necessary, and they often get in the way of doing things. And sort of, as we heard this morning, that this kind of disruption can be very useful, and it can offer an occasion for us to kind of reconsider and reformulate our practices and how we enact them. Um, so, and this is just a very quick little bio slide of who we are. I'm presenting here on kind of behalf of myself and my colleague Andrew Gardner, who wasn't able to make it today. And so just a very brief outline is that Rebecca is going to talk a little bit about the history of the Digital Humanities Innovation Lab. Ali will talk about some of the infrastructural challenges of upgrades in our kind of current situation. And then I'll return to discuss some of the potential solutions and opportunities that arose from our grappling with a large-scale process of software upgrades. With that, I'll hand it to Rebecca.
Okay, great, thanks. Hi, everybody. So the Digital Humanities Innovation Lab, I was joking earlier, I'm here to tell you about how we got into this situation, and Joey and Ali are going to help figure out how we're going to get unentangled from it. So the lab is a unit within the SFU library, and it was established in 2016, sort of a convergence of elements coming together. The library had been working on a few sort of bespoke digital projects with a few long-standing faculty collaborators that were requiring some care and love. There were new directions in research that a number of our faculty were interested in pursuing, but not anywhere really on campus for that technical support to be facilitated. And we're still in the outline, sorry. Here we go. And the VP research was very interested in big data. So there was a big data initiative that came with some funding that allowed us to augment our resources, pull them together in this formation, the Digital Humanities Innovation Lab, to do some of what you see there. So what specifically do we do? We offer consultations to folks who are considering or are working on projects. That could be faculty members, it could be research staff, it could be students thinking about digital projects and taking their research in a particular direction. We provide them some support with working with the DH tools. So sometimes they'll just need to kind of figure out which tool to use, how to get going on it. We offer workshops, as many of you do as well, I'm sure. The bulk of what we do and where our resources go is to develop digital projects and technical development. So that we'll talk about more today. And then in the last couple of years, more work moving into sort of grant support for digital projects. Who we are. So this slide is sort of who we are today. And we'll show you where we kind of how we've morphed over time. Right now, we're actually officially now a subunit within the library's Research Commons, and we fall under the Associate Dean of Digital Strategy. Our team is currently comprised of a digital scholarship librarian, so that has been me filling the role, Ali filling the role. We move our portfolios around. 2 developers, as you've heard, Joey and Andrew, and at any time, 2 to 5 graduate students at the MA, PhD level who are digital fellows engaged in different kinds of work with the lab, sometimes on projects, sometimes with teaching, variety of different approaches to their work. Things that we are really concerned about right now, as our presentation might allude to, is digital preservation, scalable infrastructure in libraries, and project sunsetting sustainability, of which those topics and some others like knowledge mobilization, open access publishing, that sort of thing, we also research and publish on ourselves. But we've had different configurations over our time. So 2016, Big Data Initiatives announced, the library received some funding to create the DHIL. So generally that's where the funding comes from. That initiative, as with many university initiatives is time limited. And by 2023, the funding needs to come from elsewhere. So currently the library and the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences are major funders of the lab. Staffing, at the time we had two faculty co-directors, half of a digital scholarship library. It says one, but at 0.5. One developer who was technically 0.8 in the lab and also doing some work for library systems, and two digital fellows. You'll notice that we do not have faculty co-directors at the moment. With the move into the library, we're sort of rethinking how to integrate that researcher piece, faculty academic researcher piece, into sort of the advisory of the lab, the directions of the lab, because, well, for many reasons, but our faculty co-directors put in so much time, and we wanted to be a bit more sustainable for them to participate in the work. We have two full-time developers, so on that, and 4 digital fellows. As far as projects, you can see it really jumped up. We consulted with and provided at a consult level support for about 15 projects initially, and 6 with active development. Right now we have 22 in current development, 10 that are not active but still there, and 1 that is archived. And just to give you kind of a sense of how those projects have developed over the time, in 2017 we were funded, as I said, through big data. Project intakes was in 6-month cycles, so trying to keep things kind of small and manageable and iterative. We had some seed projects to sort of develop a proof of concept for the project proposal cycle for the lab, and the project development cycle, I should say. And interest matched capacity, both expertise-wise, the kinds of projects we were doing really matched the kinds of interests that our developer had at the time. And we, like, the people who were interested in working with us, we could manage that much. 2019, those projects are going great, getting increasingly complex. They're taking on new directions in their own research. But there's also new projects that are interested. The lab's kind of a little bit more known, more people coming to talk with us, starting to be leveraging grant applications. So now we're getting into a capacity challenge here. 2021, this is when the changeover comes from being an initiative out of VPR to thinking about kind of the long-term model, and some challenges with sustainable funding models there. So we're exploring. Need to review our process and procedures for project work, and upgrades are looming, technical and infrastructural. And now we're here today. We have implemented some project intake changes to kind of streamline that and think more about how do we balance all of the new projects, other projects that exist, what we're being asked to do. Strategizing our upgrades, taking stock of where we are, and now planning for the future directions. So on to, do you want me to do this?
All right. So so the slide that you see now is an example of, I think, both the challenge that we faced in actually managing those 33 or so projects that we listed on that slide, sort of an example of like what's in our brains and the kinds of meetings that we were having in managing all of these different projects that are at wildly different stages and different things from us. And we're connecting with all of the kind of different PIs and students and everyone who's affiliated with these different projects. So just to give you a sense of thinking about this from a really kind of like polished perspective, and then in practice, it's obviously much messier and more complex. So just to give you a sense of, how we were able to kind of move from those like initial kind of concept of the lab into this kind of early development phase for these projects. We really worked very quickly and very responsively to the folks who are interested in working with the lab. I think like many things in libraries, you get the funding and then you really want to make something good happen quickly. So you're like, hey, we've done it. Like come hang out. So that was obviously like the initial enthusiasm was there. That was wonderful. And there was really a focus in the lab to kind of recognize whether or not the project's needs could be met by working with either an existing platform or if we needed to kind of branch out into something else. And both because of the interests of the staff who are in the lab and also the nature of the projects, rather than adopting kind of a single platform like Omeka or OJS, we adopted a single framework. So Symphony is the major one that most of these projects we're using as a base for all of these database-backed projects. And so because, many of these projects, I think, like many of us in libraries, you you spin something up and then everybody's like, oh, I also want that. We had lots of people who were interested in databases. So the projects shared, similar requirements, and thus we're able to share bundles of code that handle kind of the common features and common requirements for all of these different projects together. And just sort of a note on sort of how this was managed. The server infrastructure was managed primarily by library systems and central IT. And since the projects were all kind of very similar, they were placed on a single server as subdirectories. So it was a very sort of effective, straightforward way to work. And so by 2022, we had 14 of these Symfony projects, all running on a single server, all running PHP 7 and Symfony 4.4. And I don't know how many of you will be familiar with this, but the image that you see on your screen is really an illustration of where we got to in this kind of critical problem that we're pointing to. So we have on the left-hand side there, the Symfony release schedule and the PHP release schedule. And I'll just flip to the next one where you can see where the versions that we were running are on these charts. So version 4.4 is not actually even depicted anymore on the Symfony release schedule. And PHP is end of life. So both of these were end of life. And because of the nature of the projects, they are all interconnected, right? All of these projects are all running on the same server. And so they all require these kind of really urgent, non-trivial updates all at the same time. And the original developer, who had been kind of the person working on all this, actually left SFU Library in 2022. So we didn't necessarily have on our team that expertise anymore to draw from. So it created this really critical juncture point where we needed to make some decisions about how we were going to move forwards, tackle these upgrades, but also really think through everything that we were working on. So the first thing that we did is to really take stock of the status of all the different projects in the lab, recognizing that while we had these kind of 14 Symfony projects and a whole bunch of other projects that are all happening, they're not all at the same phase of development, and the engagement from all of the different researchers that we were working with was not sort of uniform. So we have projects that are very much in active development. Folks are meeting with us. We know what they want to do. The project is kind of an active part of their research agenda. And then we have ones that have come in that are maybe a bit more dormant, right? And I think we're all familiar with this. People get busy. It doesn't necessarily fit in the research agenda. There's lots of different reasons why this might be the case. We don't necessarily know from these folks if they're planning to return or if they've moved on, and there's some interesting conversations to be had there. There are projects that we would sort of categorize as abandoned. People came, we were excited to work on it, they were excited to work on it. It's kind of, in the past now. And then we have a very small select handful that we would consider done, which is always very exciting when you can kind of consider a digital project completed. But recognizing that these typically fall in categories of things that were tools that were like created for a specific activity. And, maybe that paper's been written, that book's been written, and we can kind of move on from them. So really getting a sense of where each of the projects that we're working on is at. And then in addition to that kind of straightforward sort of taking stock, we also wanted to think about what the overall strategy or principles would be for tackling these upgrades. We have these 14 projects
questions about archiving, and about what constitutes the core of the project, and what needs to be preserved. And the answers to these questions, so like what is the archive and preservation plan for? What needs to be preserved? Well, the answers to these questions we found really depend on who you ask, and their roles within the project. Different individuals are going to have different concerns and different interests in that longevity of the project. As Ali mentioned earlier, some of these projects are actually understood as tools that were used very um, uh, purposefully for a particular monograph or for a particular research project. And once that project is over, the digital thing can cease to exist. As the other projects consider their digital project as the thing, their resource that they want to have exist forever. So there's differing understandings of projects, both between the PI and the lab and within the lab itself. So getting a kind of a definition and an understanding of what it is that we build when we're building projects. And then we thought of new directions, including, and I like that we were already talking about fingers earlier too and hands, so this works really nicely. So the new directions for us include things like a number of possibilities, especially now that we're going into this sort of Dockerized, containerized framework, which allows us to have individual projects sort of exist on their own and allow for that experimentation. Um, we are cautious, of course, of thinking, oh, this thing is going to be the answer to all of our problems. But I think it will allow us to cautiously adopt new technologies and experiment with things and have a sort of self-contained, documented sort of set, like a project itself is self-contained and documented. Um, it will also allow us to use the right technology for the job. So rather than having 14 projects all running the same thing, we can look at each project specifically and ask questions and have the dialogue in order to make the project's technology match the research questions and understand that sort of socio-technical production of a research project within the digital humanities. So what's next for us? What would we do developing some projects to see if there are better ways to advance the research? As I said, we can sort of cautiously adopt new technologies, new frameworks, cater to the expertise of both the researchers and researchers both outside of the lab and within the lab to sort of experiment. And allow the developers to build their own distinct portfolios of expertise in a way that doesn't necessarily affect the entire structure of the lab. So some of our takeaways from this process have been that documentation, and there's always exhortations to document everything all the time, always, and we'll repeat them again. So document everything, technical, administrative, and social. So when people have been, what conversations have happened, what are plans, things like domain names, who owns a domain name has become a very important question in the lab. And that kind of collaboration and communication is key. And what we discovered as well is that in projects where the developers had a more embedded relationship or the lab had a more embedded relationship in the project, the questions of what do we archive, what's this project about, where is this project, were very easily answerable. It was much more difficult when we maybe didn't have contact with the PI for 6 months or a year. We have to assume that all projects will continue in the long term, and we have to assume that projects will not continue in the long term. So we have to be prepared both that a project will exist and want to exist for 10, 15 years. We also have to think that maybe the project won't last more than 6 months or a year, especially if it's not grant funded. And we have to have those contingencies in place. And that strategic planning, priorities, vision, mission, and values matter, and an iterative process of ensuring that we're constantly or not constantly, but regularly thinking about what we're doing, why we're doing it, and intentional with the kind of practices we're we're engaging in. So what we're still grappling with, and these are sort of questions we've been wondering ourselves within the lab, and we want to pose them outwards as well, is about fostering innovation and also setting boundaries and managing expectations. How do we do that? How do we sort of balance that sort of double edge of, yes, experimentation is amazing. I don't have a lot of time to experiment with things, however. How do you also equitably balance access to resources? So not giving preference to these large projects that have a lot of grant funding when maybe there's a smaller proof of concept project that also needs support and maybe even more exciting. And that's sort of leads to the next question of it may be more exciting agenda or interest. So how do we sort of balance the priorities of a project with the priorities of the lab? And then how do we manage the library service provider mentality in how we work with our projects? So how sort of reckon with that we are collaborators, researchers that are providing a service within the library. Thank you.
Questions?
When I was looking at the agenda, I was, I think, most looking forward to this because it's a problem that we kind of hit often of all of our software packages or all of our, upgrades do depend on each other, and we want to upgrade just the one that we need to, or I guess the current project we're working on, we want to not downgrade, but find a cost saving measure of moving to a different platform, and that has that domino effect. But as I'm listening to this and thinking about some of our past talks, we've talked about standardization and the expectations of language we're using, and I see that as being, here is a thing that we're using. Should we be staticizing or should we be migrating those things as well as the packages we're using? Was that included in your building of this framework? So using standardized language or migrating that language in the way that you're.
I can take a stab at this one. So one of the things that I think our new developer found as he came in and sort of took on this challenge, because as I said, the person who developed all these the framework and then all these projects sort of parted. And what he found is that the existing projects had a lot of boilerplate that was kind of baked in and sort of replicated. And that was the kind of like main frustration with doing these upgrades, is that if we just upgraded them and kind of kept them as they were, that there was a lot of checking each and every point to kind of make sure that all the kind of code had been copied over correctly for that very particular project and its interpretation. And so I think, I don't know if I'm answering your question exactly, but it was just a move away from that and to kind of say, what does this particular project need as opposed to what does this kind of single framework that we're running need to be provided concept than a standardization orientation. I'll let Joey jump in.
Yeah, well, I'll just say I think that is part of the tension is that I think originally it was we wanted to work really, really quickly and make get a lot of projects out there, but we also I think recognize that individual projects have specific needs, and so they started to fork and then they started to diverge and then kind of sort of like expand outwards, and then we get all of a sudden this knotted sort of relationship because some of them are really divergent, some of them are not, and migrating becomes a very difficult thing. And I think what we recognize is that projects are necessarily unique. They are always going to have different sort of needs, and that rather than try to fight that, we're going to try and accommodate that kind of specificity of research question and problem and topic for each one, even if that means a little bit more work per project. Yeah.
Just a question about the project's experience in terms of advocacy and publicity to the university community in reflecting on those last two slides where you had to balance kind of immediate benefits and possible experimentation, possible innovation, trying to find new stuff or better stuff that you might be able to develop and your needs versus the needs of the researchers. What's been your experience with the upper administration and with the faculty in terms of making that sort of doing that networking?
Sure. So we'll go maybe back to the slide about funding. And so we had the funding for the initiative, which was 3 years, extended to 4 years. And that was kind of the time we felt, at least in the lab, to sort of demonstrate like this research is happening already. There are not the resources available to augment the research in the way that that we know researchers would like to go. So how can we get proof of it? Particularly, we want proof of concept projects partially to see what sort of the boundaries were of what we were capable of doing and what people wanted from the lab before we kind of put too much of a message out there, but also so folks could have proof of concept prototypes, that sort of thing, to take to their colleagues outside of the university, inside of the university, to get feedback on, promote, even if they were not in the finished state. People had different feelings about if they wanted to do that or not, how much they wanted to workshop it publicly before it was kind of done to a point that they wanted to. But I think that the consistent message that we heard broader is that there is investment in continuing to support that and recognition that we struggle a lot with being part of big data. But it's complex data and it's big, but not in the way you're really talking about it with everybody else. So I think that there has been that recognition. Would be like to see more support, always more support, always more ways to meet the needs. But there is a growing set of researchers. The projects we've had some receptions in the time, or we could have some receptions. There are some projects that have launched at SFU, but also like at various disciplinary conferences, publications that are coming out about these projects. So I would say that, yeah, there's been positive feedback, but we're still sort of wrangling with this sort of more pragmatic endorsements, I guess, finalizing that, firming those up a little bit more so that we can kind of continue to do that, as Joy's alluding to at the end there, about strategic planning and looking at where we are now and how things have changed, and where we would go from. So that's kind of a rambly way of saying, like, yes, positivity, reaching for more.
I'm curious how you manage access to your developers, because in my experience, faculty members have a totally like insatiable appetite for development time, and giving folks direct access to developers, it makes it very hard for developers to stay on track with like 15 different projects. So I'm just curious how you set parameters around the amount of development time that you can give to any given project.
So I think you may have noticed in our early kind of timeline slide, we talked about having project cycles in 6-month is kind of intake model. And the idea there was that we were asking people to kind of scope up what they wanted to do in the next 6 months, and that we would use that as a kind of guide for how how many people wanted to work with us in that period, how much work we thought they needed to do, and what was possible. And as things have kind of snowballed, that's become more and more difficult. And we also have projects that are more and more complex. So like there's no kind of one size fits all model. We have some projects that are 7-year grant funded commitments, and we know that work is going to happen kind of over the next 7 years. And we have other folks who are grad students who are graduating in 4 months, and they can't really have us push project slightly down the line, whereas the grant funded project, there's a little bit more leniency there. So it is challenging. And I think also to your point about when you're in direct contact, it becomes much more difficult for us to sort of say yes or no. Like, we're also invested very much in the success of these projects. We're really, when a PI says like, here's what I want to do, like we're motivated to make those things happen. And so it is I think very much about that kind of communication, being in project agency to be able to say like, I want to do this. Here's what I think this is going to look like. I think it's going to take, this many hours, days, months, whatever. And giving them the tools to say yes, but also having Rebecca and I here to kind of back them up and being able to say like, actually, we have this broader context. So, here's what I can give you now, and knowing where they're coming from.
But I think it's you guys, anyway, you guys looked at the project intake cycle too to sort of facilitate some of that, because 6 months like that worked when there was only a few projects and you could sort of scope a few months at a time. Here's a small piece of the project we'll do. But now when you're managing all those different timelines that I was talking about, now it's sort of like more annually. And you have the sort of consultation as part of filling, like essentially filling out the application form with the PI. I don't know, so you can speak more about it if you want, but so some of those procedures have changed to kind of address the shifting landscape of how many hours can one project use at this time or needs at this time, or what commitments does the library have that we have to sort of pull back at certain points in the year.
Yeah, but I think it's a struggle.
Thank you for the presentation. Really admirable work, really great application of the endings principles and forward thinking, and that prognosis of like resources being outstripped by demand. Like every library is facing it. We also have a lot of digital work, especially the larger scale work, exceeds an individual institution. And yet all of this is sort of grounded. Everyone in the room is nodding and going, yes, I recognize this, I recognize this. How would you imagine being able to collaborate across institutions and share resources to address some of these challenges?
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. And I mean, given the proximity of 3 universities of UBC, SFU, and UVic, and just sort of good relationships across all of them, we have been able to do a little bit of that, starting to sort of seed that kind of work. So there's a project at UBC that I was a part of when I was a master's student there, and when I came to SFU, I brought that project with me. And the Endings Project is another example that I was working on the Endings Project before I started at SFU, and bringing that kind of with me as well. Obviously, that is not sustainable in terms of, having one person who advocates for something and kind of just brings that together. But I do think there are really good mechanisms, maybe at like local levels or at national levels, to think about where expertise is and where alignment of that expertise can happen. One of the challenges, though, is I think all this behind it, and maybe the institution's researchers are not charged for it, but the external ones are charged for it. But then how do you balance power with if right now I have the autonomy to say I don't think that's a good idea, I don't want to do it, but if there's money coming in, how do you balance that a bit better? And I think that's something that I think is continually kind of a challenge, and something that we're working through, is to figure out how do we sort of respect that relationship, but also respect our identities within the library as researchers, and not just providing sort of technical support for projects.
Last one.
Thank you for the presentation. It was really good. Appreciated the happy ending because it was a horror show at the beginning, so I was very scared for your single server. Which relates to my question. You're standing up a nice architecture with the containerization and the Docker backend. And to follow up to your statement about just providing technical backing, like is that in the future plans for this team, is to bring on more of an infrastructure side to it? Because I mean, you're gonna grow if you're gonna keep these on. And so your container orchestration and access to all of that, like I'm just curious if that's in your future growth plans, or where you're going with it.
Great question. I think for the infrastructure part, I think part of what we're doing here is trying to kind of, as part of this experimentation, is really make sure that we can do this. So we are adding another server and going to be load balancing between the two servers to make sure that we have enough capacity. But part of why we're also doing Docker containers is that they are kind of like if there is a need to say, let's say the researcher leaves the university, we can still give them their whole Docker container and they can just take it. And their other university will be more readily able to do that versus say spinning up a PHP 7.4 thing. So I think that is part of our plans. And you know we're cautiously optimistic that our current infrastructure will be sufficient for the kinds of project, but we're also hoping to take on more projects that are in the sort of static vein, which take up far less infrastructural resources.
Are you looking backed by a central IT department? Like,
Yeah, so we have library IT who does a lot of our server admin stuff, but we also do sort of it's an interesting relationship because we sort of do some server admin and the library IT does server admin, and then there's central behind that. So we do have IT support in that way too.
Okay, I think it's lunchtime. Thank you.
It's a great morning. Thank you.